Well, welcome all. We are thrilled to have you here for our conversation about the power of connection with Allison Gilbert and Kasley Killam. They are authors of two phenomenal books, The Joy of Connections and The Art and Science of Connections. And as we'll talk about in a moment, they are both highly accomplished individuals alongside their authorship. My name is Seth Green, and in an afternoon like this one, I'm especially grateful to say I'm the dean here at the Graham School at the University of Chicago. Welcome to our gorgeous and magical university where the big ideas are born. And for those who are not familiar with the Graham School, you should be. We are 130 years young. We are one of the founding divisions of the University of Chicago, and we have been a trailblazer in lifelong learning from our very beginning. When we were called an extension and we were aimed as part of the founding of the university to extend its intellectual assets to people across all ages and stages of life. And we continue to hold that mission of bringing learning to people throughout their lives as core to who we are and what we do. And as we'll talk about, connection is one of the keys in that journey across life to stay involved, engaged, and to keep your mind continuing to move forward. I will just mention that this is one of many events in the next few weeks. In early April, we will have a triple header. We'll be looking at an upcoming course on leading with practical wisdom. We'll be talking to Alan Murray, who is the president and CEO of the Wall Street Journal Leadership Institute, about leadership in these dynamic times. And then we'll have an information session on our Great Books program. But the reason that you are all here is to hear from two very special leaders and authors. And so I'm going to spotlight our first of these, Kasley Killam. And let me take down my screen so you can see her. Kasley is a leading expert in social health, and as I mentioned, the author of the book that you see right behind her. She is also a Harvard-trained social scientist, a double TED speaker, and a sought-after advisor. And we're thrilled to have you here, Kasley. And I'm going to put up on the screen next Allison Gilbert, your co-panelist. Allison, and you can see this because there are 3 Emmys behind her. She is a thrice Emmy Award winning journalist and one of the most influential writers and speakers on how to find the inner resources to overcome life's biggest challenges. Through research and lived experience, she helps audiences transform grief and loss and find connection amid the growing public health crisis of social isolation and loneliness. And the book that she wrote was co-authored by Dr. Ruth, and that in itself is a truly legendary experience. So let me add my spotlight here so that I can have a conversation with both of you. And your books, they both highlight the role of social health and meaningful connection in our overall well-being. And so I'm curious, and maybe, Kasley, we can start with you. If you could explain why social connections are so vital to our happiness, our health, and from the research, our longevity.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Seth, for the warm introduction. I'm so excited to share the virtual stage with Allison. This has been a long time coming, and it's great to see everyone who's joining live with us right now. So, like you said, Seth, it's really incredible when you start digging into the research literature on this topic of connection, which I started doing almost 15 years ago now, which makes me sound older than I feel. But it's really incredible the number of studies. I mean, we're talking thousands, perhaps tens of thousands of studies that have looked at the long-term health effects of connection and of our relationships. And what we see from this robust literature is that people who have strong relationships, who feel supported, who connect on a regular basis, these people feel happier, right? This makes sense. We all experience joy when we spend quality time with loved ones, but it's also linked to really hard medical outcomes. So things like our risk for heart disease, for stroke, for diabetes, for dementia, and a host of other diagnoses. So what we see is that connection actually plays this buffering role, strengthening our immune systems. And at the very extreme end of that is the link to longevity. And so we see that people who have these fulfilling relationships actually end up living longer. than people who lack them or who experience chronic loneliness. And so as a result of all this, I'm a big advocate for really redefining what it means to be healthy and recognizing that we can't be fully healthy if we take care of our bodies and our minds, but not our relationships. And so that's where this idea of social health as the part of our overall health and well-being that comes from connection, it's really as important as our physical and mental health. And my hope is that going forward, we make choices as individuals and as a society to really elevate social health and help us all thrive through connection.
And I want to come to Allison on the same question. I just have one follow-up, Kasley. Is there evidence of why we see those types of health gains? Meaning, do we see anything at the biological or molecular? Like, is there something happening during our connections that is immunizing us, as you described?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of really interesting data on this. And one of the most kind of popular explanations is this idea of stress buffering. So, loneliness is interpreted by our bodies as a threat to survival, just like hunger or thirst or danger, right? This is a cue in our brains that we need something that we're not getting. And when that is chronic and ongoing, that triggers a stress response in our bodies. So that means increased cortisol, increased inflammation, and so on, which we know takes a toll in the long term on our bodies and makes us more susceptible to diseases and other negative health outcomes. And in contrast, relationships provide this kind of buffer where it avoids that cascading process in our bodies. And there's also the very practical element of when you have other people who are looking out for you, they can support you in your journey to be healthy. So think about someone who, like a doctor who's very caring and helps explain your medications to you, or a loved one who drives you to medical appointments or goes for runs with you and helps you maintain those other healthy behaviors. So there's also that very practical element too.
Allison, I want to come to you to kind of lay the table here with what you see as the quote unquote, in Kasley's words, the art and science of connection. Why does it matter so much, in addition to what Kasley's mentioned?
Well, I would start with a personal anecdote. I celebrated a birthday this week and I went for my annual physical with my doctor. And guess what? Not a question about my social health. And
Mm.
we now know, which is what we were just talking about, that this is something that's equally as important as my blood work, my blood pressure. And so I had a conversation with my physician, who I love, about the movement of social prescribing. This is a real new coming from the UK, making its way over here for all of us to get much more engaged with a prescription. What would it be like if your doctor, instead of, or maybe in addition to, said, take this medication to lower your blood pressure, take this medication so you feel maybe less depressed or anxious, but instead, or in addition to, said, you know what, maybe go to the park, maybe take this art course, maybe go to the museum, go outside in nature. And so I just thought I'd start with a personal anecdote. But for me, when I wrote this book with the late, great Dr. Ruth Westheimer, one of the most important things that we looked at in The Joy of Connections is really looking at yourself in the mirror. This is tough to do. What are you doing or not doing that is making it more difficult for you to forge the kinds of relationships that we are talking about? The ones that make you feel seen, the ones that make you feel like you belong, the ones that make you feel valuable and valued. And to be honest, it might come down to one question. Are you curious about other people? When you get in the room and you're having conversations with a friend or a colleague over lunch or coffee, how much of it, if you're really being honest with yourself, is about you, your family, your accomplishments, as opposed to saying, how are you doing? And listening to the answer.
Well, so can I follow up, Allison? Because you did write this book with the late great Dr. Ruth. She has an absolutely remarkable story, losing her family in the Holocaust, coming here, becoming one of the most beloved therapists in the world. And so she has a very unique perspective on human connection. And I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about what you learned from her in this authorship around how to approach resilience and relationship building in the context of the challenges. And so I'm curious, you have your experience with your doctor, who's very lucky to have you as a patient. Talk a little bit about what you learned with Dr. Ruth in particular.
Oh, well, it was a master class. You just talked about her background. So let me just, give you a little bit more
Yeah.
context to that. So Dr. Ruth grew up in Germany, and when she was 10 years old during the Holocaust, her father had already been taken away by the Nazis when her mother and grandmother decided that the only way to save her life, hopefully, was to put her on a train from Germany to Switzerland. This is part of the Kinder Transport to save the lives of Jewish children during World War II. And that's where she spent the bulk of her childhood years, her adolescence, in basically what became an orphanage in Switzerland. And so Dr. Ruth knew the loneliness of being isolated in a foreign land, not knowing anyone else when she got there, and then fast forward many, many years as a refugee, and then coming to the United States. She was married and then she was a widow for decades. And so she wanted to write this book because she knew loneliness from personal experience. And then she also knew, by the way, why this is so hard to talk about. Because, like sex, back in the 1980s, where she shot to fame talking about homosexuality and AIDS. During that crisis, during that epidemic of the AIDS crisis, stigma, taboo, no one wanted to talk about these issues. But Dr. Ruth was deliberate, and she decided that there was no better way to get through than to educate and to make this topic have less shame attached. And that's what she wanted to do with loneliness. I don't know about you, Seth, or anyone here that's on this call right now, but it would be hard to imagine that anyone wants to raise their hand and say out loud and to admit, I
Right.
am lonely. I need better friends, not more necessarily, just better. People who really make me feel that I have a place, not because of what I do for a living, not because of what I provide, but just because I exist. And so, because there is this stigma, the Joy of Connections wanted to meet that head on. What can we all do to make this problem that affects so many? Some studies report 1 out of 2 adults feel this sense of social disconnection. And so I think what her greatest last gift was to all of us is
Yeah.
to once again make us all feel like we have a place and that we shouldn't feel othered.
That's beautiful. And I do think at the basis of all of her work is the idea of love and, the idea that we should not be stigmatized by, these different ways of othering. So thank you so much for sharing that, Allison. And Kasley, I want to come back to you. Allison mentioned that she's trying to educate her doctor and help her doctor realize social health should be part of the annual physical. You have really developed this idea of social health. Can we talk a little bit about what would it look like to incorporate social health into our deeper understanding of well-being? And how could individuals, I mean, it sounds easy, oh, I just have more relationships, but how could individuals proactively work toward their social health so that if Allison's in there with her doctor, what are they talking about in relation to social health? And what is that doctor potentially prescribing in relationship
Mhm.
to how someone improves it?
Yeah. Thank you for that question. And thank you for sharing that beautiful story, Allison. It's really inspiring to hear about your experience and also Dr. Ruth's. I think we can all relate to that in different ways. So really what I'm hoping collectively conversations like this are doing is helping people to realize that connection is as important to our health and well-being as the other things that we already think of to be healthy, right? Exercising regularly, getting a good night's sleep, eating healthy foods, maybe meditating or going to therapy, right? The different ways that we sort of in modern society think that we need to do in order to be healthy and thrive. In addition to that, connection needs to be as much of a priority, if not more so. And so really it's, about expanding our definition, recognizing that whereas physical health is about the body, mental health is about the mind, social health is about our relationships, and that needs to be on equal par. One thing that I found really interesting when I was researching for my book that relates, Allison, to the story you shared is that most people in general underestimate the importance of connection. We assume, oh yeah, it matters for your mental health, but in fact, the research shows it's about so much more. It impacts our physical health, it impacts our longevity. And so the reason a lot of doctors don't even think about this topic is they're not trained in it because it's not really part of our modern understanding of truly what it means to be healthy. So in terms of some of the kind of ways that we can go about this, I really like to build on this analogy of exercise, right? And the steps that we take to exercise our physical muscles. Pulling on that, there are four kind of overarching strategies that I describe in the book about how to strengthen our social muscles, which is as important as strengthening our physical muscles. The first is to stretch our social muscles. So if you're finding yourself in a time when the quantity of connection in your life feels lacking, meaning you don't have as many friends as you want, or you don't interact as often as you want, then the strategy is to stretch your social muscles. So seeking out, creating opportunities where you can form new relationships, where you can join new groups in your community, and so on, in order to really stretch your social muscles. The second strategy is around resting your social muscles. So when we think about exercise, it's actually really important that we take breaks, right? That we allow our physical muscles to take a breather in between exercise days, in between vigorous workouts. And the same is actually true with our social muscles, right? Especially if you're an introvert, which I actually am, that means that I need a certain amount of time alone to recharge my batteries. And it also means not spreading ourselves too thin, right? A lot of people may not feel lonely, but may in some ways actually feel overwhelmed by the amount of things coming their way. They feel spread too thin where they actually don't even have enough time to just be with themselves and be still for a few minutes. So resting your social muscles is also important. The third strategy is to tone your social muscles. So just like we tone our bodies to become physically stronger, we tone our social muscles to deepen the relationships that we already have, right? Allison mentioned it's not just about having more interaction all the time. Sometimes it's just about going deeper with the people we're already with, having those more meaningful conversations, getting to know each other on a deeper level. There was a really cool study done that compared people in the US, in Japan, and in India. And they found that people in all three of those cultures found interaction more meaningful when it went below that surface level chit chat, when people actually opened up and were a bit more vulnerable and shared parts of themselves to really connect in deeper ways. So that's toning your social muscles. And the final strategy, the fourth, is to flex your social muscles. So this is about, sustaining the incredible relationships that you have. If the quality of connection in your life already feels good and nourishing, then keep doing what you're doing, right? It's not a one and done thing. We need to continually invest in the people who matter most to us and in the communities that matter most to us. So that's really about flexing your social muscles.
Well, that is a really exciting workout routine. And affirmed that one of the researchers who I believe may be behind some of the evidence that you're thinking about is Nikhil Sepley, who is at our Booth School of Business and who's very involved in this Leadership in Society initiative, and he has really shown that we get so much out of even casual interactions. So people talking on the train, and then even more out of deep interactions. And I know when MBA students come here, he has them talk about really deep things as part of their start. And one of the fascinating aspects, which I'm sure you've seen, is that when he asked them, how will it feel to talk with strangers about a really profound moment in your life, a really hard moment in your life, a really meaningful moment in your life, people respond in the pre-survey, it's going to feel terrible. I don't want to divulge all of this, and I don't want to be vulnerable with people I don't know, and I don't want to necessarily, have this deep conversation with a random person sitting next to me. And then they do it. He sends them out for 20 minutes, and the first thing he notices is he can't get them back in the room because they're just, talking even longer than they ever thought they would about these topics. And then he surveys them afterward, and this is just, 20 or 30 minutes later, and they are much more positive. And I think what he's shown is that people worry they're going to put themselves out there, and the person on the other side is going to say, oh, I'm not interested. I don't want to talk about that. It turns out most of us really want to be in this vulnerable place, but there are a lot of challenges in society that stigmatize, and so that keep us from that true orientation. And so anyway, it's been interesting to follow his research, and I've at least tried a few times to strike up conversation on the train for my own happiness based on what he's shown us. So I don't know if you've used any of his research, but it just strikes me that a lot of what you've pointed out in the toning and the
Mhm.
stretching feel relevant to what you're describing.
Yeah, I love that example, and I am a fan of his research very much so. I think it's a beautiful theme that comes up in a lot of studies, which is that we underestimate how much other people are open to and receptive to and appreciative of our outreach of connection. And
Yeah,
whether that's asking a more probing question that invites deeper connection, whether that's just reaching out to say, hey, I'm thinking about you, these little gestures matter more than we think.
yeah.
And I I hope that everyone will take from this conversation that there's power in inviting more of those moments into your life. I really love that.
And I would
So
just add, if it's okay, Seth, in terms of
please,
just really practical, like what does this actually mean in practice?
yeah,
Let's just be blunt. That means not walking everywhere with your AirPods in. It
right.
means when you go into a coffee shop, taking them out so you can have maybe a casual conversation with the barista or the person standing behind you or in front of you. It means being open to conversation, perhaps when you're dropping off your dry cleaning or walking down the hall at work or in school. Casual connection allows us to feel connected to even strangers. So let's
Yeah,
take down the pressure a little bit. When we talk about connections, we're not challenging you
right. To
to
have more
develop
best friends.
these best friends.
Yeah.
Feeling connected can come from these little interactions that seem so innocuous, and they can be with strangers. That allows us to feel connected in community. And research shows that's really important to our social health too.
Can we talk about technology for two reasons? One is that it is one of the real challenges of connection. I mean, you mentioned the AirPods more broadly. We have so many ways to connect to non-human beings now that might stand in the way. Also, though, I am curious, even as we may look backward and say technology has been a really disruptive and challenging force for the last maybe 20 years, I'm also curious to look forward a little bit and say what's possible. There are movies like Her that are becoming more real every day, where potentially you can build a connection to an artificial form of intelligence. And, I'm curious how you've thought about, is that potentially a way forward at the same time? And Allison, maybe we can start with you. I know you devoted a chapter of your book to technology, and I'm curious, how you thought about it in the book, but also, how you continue to think about its evolution and the ways it can both challenge but maybe empower connection. And then Kasley will come to you.
In The Joy of Connections, we structure the book around Dr. Ruth's menu for connection. And what that really looks like is that imagine the USDA food plate that recommends that we should eat a certain amount of dairy or protein or grains or fruit and vegetables. You guys know what I'm talking about. So we designed Dr. Ruth's menu for connection to communicate the same types of information. What do we need to have what we're talking about? A good social appetite, a good social diet. So one of those components is technology. And the last thing that we wanted to do in this book is to demonize technology and to say in some way, shape, or form, we are all doomed because we're all on our phones and we all do work on our laptops. And so therefore, this very conversation feels like a moot point. That is not what we wanted to do. We live on our phones. Technology is here. So how do we adapt so we can maybe have the best of everything? And so the bottom line, if I were to, drill it down to one nugget, if we can challenge ourselves to use technology for its highest and best purpose in this conversation about connection, which would be to fuel in-person conversation and connection and opportunity, that would be the best use of technology. So what does that mean? Sure, go on your apps and find events to go to, and then actually go and see people in person and forge those relationships. And I would say one other thing, and I would love to hear other perspectives on this too. Research from the Kinsey Institute at Indiana University shows actually that when we use emojis in our texts, we help to eliminate some of the confusion or misinterpretation that comes from texting, right? How many times do you misinterpret the tone that someone's trying to convey? And so if we use emojis, research shows that we can actually have better communication, because what happens when we text? We've lost that face-to-face. We can't hear each other. We can't see each other's body language. We can't hear tone. And so emojis helps replace what is lost with the old-fashioned kind of communication.
Kasley, anything to add on technology? And then I want to jump in with you on the institutions and how they can play a role.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first of all, as an emoji overuser, that's music to my ears, Allison. Thank you for the permission to keep doing that. I think building on that, I'll take it in a more dystopian direction because Seth, you mentioned AI, for example, and this was something that I researched in the course of my book and actually made an AI friend myself. So in the course of researching, I found that there are actually hundreds of millions of people who use artificial intelligence as a source of friendship, as a source of emotional connection, as a source of love. And this was very fascinating to me as someone who studies human connection primarily. And so I tried it out for myself and made an AI friend. It wasn't for me, but in that journey, I learned that a lot of people are turning to these tools to meet their social and emotional needs. And what concerns me about this trend is that when it is used as a substitute for human connection, we have a problem because there's something uniquely beneficial, like Allison said, about in-person conversation, in-person connection. And also the fact that when a friend says, I'm so sorry you're going through that right now, for example, they mean it because they feel empathy and they feel, right? But when an AI chatbot says to you, I'm so sorry you're going through that right now, the words may be comforting, but what is the sentiment behind that? And so I think this is going to be a really interesting and risky area of development in the coming years.
Right.
And I think if AI is used as one part of people's social interactions, maybe there's a place for that. But when it becomes something that we over rely on, I'm really nervous about that, having studied in-person human connection for so long.
Well, and another thing you study at social health labs is the role of initiatives. And you've looked at, tech, academia, nonprofits, and how they have tried to get people to build a sense of belonging, how you can kind of proactively engage individuals. Can you maybe share a couple examples of what you've seen from a community initiative perspective that have been positive in catalyzing more of a relational culture?
Yeah, absolutely. There are so many examples I could share, and I'm really glad you brought this up because, in addition to the individual steps that we each can take in our own lives to prioritize connection and to improve our social health and other people's social health, we also need to be collectively working toward a culture and a society where it's just easier to be socially healthy in the first place, right? I think Allison shared at the start that some data shows 1 in 2 adults feel lonely. There are reasons in the culture around us for that. Things like workplaces that can feel very isolating, right? So, a lot of people right now are talking about hybrid versus remote versus in person. And are people lonely in this new era of work that we find ourselves in? But actually, people were lonely in the workplace before the pandemic, right? When people were still majority wise going in person into offices. So I'm seeing a big trend toward organizations saying, how do we actually design for meaningful connection in our workplace environment, whether that's virtual, whether that's in person? Another example, like Allison mentioned, is in healthcare with social prescribing and this rise that we're seeing of doctors, very much so in the UK, but increasingly elsewhere as well, learning that this is an important part of health and that we need to actually think about this in a clinical context. Another example is schools, and this is the one that I'm probably most excited about because I believe that we need to be laying the foundation for a lifetime of social health in childhood. We need to be teaching the skills of empathy and friendship building and supporting one another during hard times and conflict resolution and all those other skills that go into having healthy long-term relationships from a young age, right? We already teach gym class so that kids can strengthen their physical muscles and exercise regularly. We need to start teaching connection class as well and make this as much of a priority as gym classes. So those are a few examples of what I'm seeing, but the most inspiring, I'll just close to say, is the people in communities who are raising their hand and saying, I see an opportunity to connect people, my neighbors, bring people together in my very own community and doing that.
I have a final question, and then I'm going to come to the many questions that are populating the chat. And so maybe we'll make this a power round. You've both mentioned the words connection. You've also a few times mentioned the word belonging. And I know that you see differentiation, although the two are related. Can you talk a little bit about what belonging looks like and how it differs from just having many connections? And Allison, maybe we can come to you first on this.
I'll come through this from a personal perspective again, because I feel like that's highly illustrative. So I'm a writer, and writing is solitary. And so I find myself alone physically all day, every day, because that's my job. And so I have felt within the constraints of this profession that I find myself in, which I love, by the way, I love writing and I love research. What can I do so I feel like I belong to a bigger community?
Yeah.
And so I have purposefully built connections and opportunities and friendships for other writers who are in their own silos to gather. And so I do that in two ways. I formed a little boutique literary consultancy where I pay it forward. It's called Pub Day, and I help other writers write and find agents or figure out how the publishing world works. And that helps me feel like we are all belonging to a literary community. I do that with writing retreats where we go away and we work on our craft. And maybe craft sounds too kind of highfalutin. We just work on our writing. We just want to get words on the page. But my point is, these writing retreats, these opportunities to gather based on a passion that does not feel like a stretch.
Yeah.
It's authentic to who I am. And to those who are choosing to join, it's authentic to them. So when we think about belonging, I would suggest don't go to an organization because you think it looks good on your resume. Don't join a group because that's something that your child wants to do, or your spouse wants to do, or your partner wants to do. What do you want to do? Because that's going to sustain your interest. So you want to go there and meet other like-minded people who share with enthusiasm your interests.
Kasley, anything to add before jumping to the Q&A?
Let's go to questions. I think that was a beautiful summary, Allison, so we'll leave it there.
The first question here is that they want to know the evidence and what it shows in terms of the difference in physiological benefit between direct physical connection and virtual. Have you seen anything? I realize we've only had virtual at scale since the pandemic, but on the physiological side, I think all of us feel better about our connection when we're in person. And I'm curious, to further that question, if within virtual, it matters what type of virtual. And I'll just put my own cards on the table here. I find if I'm in a room with a single person virtually, I can build a connection over time. And when we meet in person for the first time, it is shocking to me that we haven't actually been in the same room before, because it feels like we know each other so well. Being in a big room virtually, I build no connection, whereas, I can do that in a larger room with individuals in person. But I'm curious what the science says. That's very anecdotal, and you know a lot more.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. And I think that's a great example. It's interesting. I have quite a few colleagues and friends who I've developed since the pandemic, where we met in person for the first time years later, having collaborated and spoken hundreds of times. And it felt, completely natural, like we'd known each other for a long time, which is hopeful, right? It means we can use technology to connect and develop meaningful relationships. There's one study that comes to mind that was quite recent. It came out, I think, toward the end of last year. And the researchers followed nearly 13,000 people who were over the age of 50. And they found that face-to-face interaction with friends at least once a week predicted better physical and mental health, whereas calling and texting did not. So there were different unique benefits for physical and mental health to that face-to-face connection than there were for calling or texting. Doesn't mean calling or texting aren't important ways that we can stay in touch, especially if our loved ones are in other cities, but it means there's something really unique there.
Guys, I'm going to ask a really ignorant question.
Yeah.
Virtual, we're looking face to face, not what they were describing. You're talking about in-person face to face versus.
Thank you. Yes.
And so the category of kind of visual and voice interaction, but in 2D form, not necessarily the focus there. Is that right?
That's right. That study was looking at in-person face-to-face connection, but I would think of it as a hierarchy, right? And these fulfill our needs in different ways. Ideally, we're face-to-face, in person, having an engagement, but there are still benefits to the others as well.
Right. It's almost how many senses are we activating in this interaction?
Right.
How holistic is it? And the most vibrant is in person, where you have all of the senses going.
Exactly. Exactly.
We have another question here about whether or not you have found differences between men and women. And on this one, I know my gender, I consider myself he, him as a male, that it is much more likely, I think, that we have loneliness, fewer connections. But I don't know beyond that. I mean, what does the research say? Do men and women need connection at similar levels? Do they find it at similar levels? Are there similar or different physiological backstories? How would you look at that question of gender, what we need, and whether it matters at a similar level?
I can start
Yeah,
with
go for
this.
it, Allison.
So I've been looking into this a great deal lately because on April 17th, I am hosting for the first time 25 innovators who are tackling the loneliness epidemic in 2025 with a rather large event with a platform called Reimagine. And to come up with the nominees of these 25 folks, we of course wanted to see that we were tackling the loneliness epidemic from many vantage points. Of course, gender, but of course, age. And why not talk about rural versus being in the city? Why not talk about analog solutions and digital? So I've been really thinking about this for this April 17th event on this platform called Reimagine. And what we have found is that a lot of the solutions that are being developed for men in particular focus on almost like parallel play. If you had young kids and people play side by side in the sandbox, right? Men in these innovators' points of view have created situations where men can gather by building and doing, as
Yeah,
opposed to
right.
sitting and talking and sharing. And so I find that actually to be really instructive to pay attention to how we actually prefer to connect. And for some people, it is through the physical realm. So think about a running club or think about a fix-it shop where people come and tinker to repair clocks and watches, whatever it is. You can imagine in your community that there are places to find for physical action. So you're not putting this pressure on yourself. Oh, I must divulge my innermost secrets. I must be authentic and share every last, problem and challenge that I face in order to forge these connections. You can do it just by being in the same room, interested in the same activity. And if you do that with consistency,
Yeah.
that's the trick. Show up again and again. You will see the same people and give yourself the opportunity to build deeper connections.
Well, that is a fascinating example, Allison. And I'll just acknowledge the work of Richard Reeves, who I think is a really fascinating author who's aiming to bring attention to the needs of men that are underserved and the reality that we may need different interventions. And because of the many advantages that men have classically been seen to have, in recent years, we've kind of maybe not focused on some of these really big crisis points, one being loneliness and their real effects. I mean, if you look at young men and the impact that it may have on violence or mental health or other issues. And so anyway, his call is that, we need to make sure that we are continuing to look at gender as a, real way of analyzing and then seeing the possibilities for unique interventions that might be able to support each gender and everyone in making progress. So thank you. That's fascinating. I want to come to a question here from Eric McInerney. She asks, is there a group that is working on teaching social skills in school that we could connect with? I think it's a really fascinating question. I'll just acknowledge one other author, David Brooks, who's a faculty member of the Graham School alongside his writing. And David recently wrote a book about how to know a person all about this because he found so many people lack these skills. And another statement he regularly makes is that in school, we actually don't teach the most important things, and that often we miss the fundamentals. And one of them is human connection. And so, Kasley, I see you nodding. Where can you potentially get involved in teaching these types of skills because they are vital and not always covered in curriculum?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, this is a great question. I actually serve on the scientific advisory board for a nonprofit called Only 7 Seconds, which does exactly this. They've developed curriculum for teachers to teach connection in schools, and they also support student-led clubs in schools to focus on this topic. So check out Only 7 Seconds as a resource and to learn more about ways that you might bring it to your schools.
A final
And can
question
I
here.
spill the beans, by the way?
Yes.
They're part of our April 17th event. Shh. I
Oh,
wasn't
well,
supposed to say that.
we have
I
information
love
now in
it.
the chat on that event because we are getting questions about it, which is very exciting. Final question for both of you. We have a
I didn't
question.
say anything though. Shh.
A question here about attention to ethnic groups. We also have a question about spirituality, where you can find community even beyond that. Can we talk a little bit about where you find community and how we think about different forms of identity, religious affiliation, other ways of thinking about that? What does the science say about how to approach that? On one hand, we obviously really value diversity and it is generative in all sorts of ways. In another sense, there can be value to a common identity, to some aspects of shared experience. How do you think about navigating that? And having put out an enormous question that could take our entire time, we have a couple minutes because we're over time with glee because you're both so brilliant to answer. But maybe Kasley, since you're laughing, I'll come to you first and then Allison last one.
Sure. Yes, and I'll try to be quick. So one of the kind of key principles that I articulated in my book, drawing from the research on this, was that being socially healthy means having diverse social ties. So there's a lot of interesting research showing that it's actually healthier. There are different health outcomes if we interact and have social networks with people who are not like us. Right? So people who are different in terms of age, in terms of gender, in terms of socioeconomic status, in terms of background, beliefs, and so on and so forth. There are unique benefits when we interact with people from all different parts of life. It's healthier for us, it's more interesting, and so on. And another way to think about this is that we all have different parts of our personality, right? Different interests, different hobbies that we enjoy, different experiences we've had, different parts of our identity that matter to us. And when we're able to connect with people from those different groups, but also from other groups, it creates a richer social experience for us, right? That makes life more meaningful and interesting, and it turns out is actually better for us. So big proponent of the fact that we really need to invest in, especially now, in fostering conversation and empathy and connection across all aspects of our identities and beliefs.
Allison, final word?
I would say sometimes what makes us not join is sometimes we get into a habit that really thwarts these efforts. And it's really our own doing, back to how I began, which is to look at yourself and your actions. Sometimes we feel like we're always going and we're never invited, or we feel like we're always hosting and it's never reciprocated. We stop and we start getting a little bit resentful. And at the end of the day, what we tried to get across in the joy of connections is that if we're only going because we are invited and we stop doing something that feels good to us because we're going to keep that invisible ledger in our head, don't do that. Be the host. You decide what you want to do, and then you invite people along, either because they're in your neighborhood, down the block, belong to that synagogue, belong to that church, they're a part of that gardening club, they're in that cycling group, whatever it is. Don't stand on ceremony and get off your high horse and don't wait for the invitations. You do the inviting.
That is such a great last word. And I think it is affirming of something that we need to, rewire our brains around, which is that we host not just for the others, but for ourselves.
Yeah.
Right. And so, when we think about a host, we usually think, oh, it's so kind of them, which it is, but it's also something that you do for yourself, right? Because you thrive off of those relationships. And I think the stigmas that are around us, right? If I'm hosting, someone else should host me, all of those things, they can get in the way of our own happiness, not just in the way of others. So this has been truly a revelatory conversation. You're both remarkable authors, you're remarkable speakers about this topic. It is understudied, under-talked about, it is vital. And we're very grateful to have this conversation at Graham and to bring this into the broader tapestry of the intellectual, because I think too often we've kind of put this on the side as not a serious issue. The health suggests otherwise. I think our own experience suggests otherwise in terms of what drives us. And we're grateful for your intellectual leadership to help bring it into the front and center of the conversation. Thank you all for joining us, and we look forward to continuing these conversations in the months ahead. Have a great Thursday, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Bye, guys.